The Arizona sun burned like molten copper across the endless stretch of red rock and dust. Samuel Cross wiped the sweat from his weathered face as his horse trudged along the narrow canyon trail, each step echoing against the towering sandstone walls. He had been riding for 3 days straight, herding a small group of cattle toward the trading post in Tucson, and every muscle in his body ached with exhaustion. The landscape around him was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, a place where a man could lose himself completely or find something he never knew he was searching for. As Samuel guided his horse around a sharp bend, he heard something that made him pull back on the reins. A low-groan, barely human drifted through the hot afternoon air. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle strapped to his saddle. In this territory, unexpected sounds usually meant trouble, and Samuel had learned long ago that caution kept a man breathing. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the gravel, and followed the sound deeper into a rocky alcove where the shadows offered brief relief from the relentless heat. What he found there made his blood run cold. A young Apache warrior lay sprawled against the rocks, his wrists bound with heavy iron chains that had been staked deep into the ground. The man's dark skin was covered in cuts and bruises, his breathing shallow and labored. Dried blood stained his torn clothing, and it was clear he had been left here to die under the merciless sun. Samuel recognized the brutal handiwork of bounty hunters, men who captured Apache warriors for the price on their heads, dead or alive. Most preferred dead because it was easier. Samuel stood frozen, his mind racing through the dangerous calculations that every man in Arizona territory had to make. Helping an Apache could mean signing his own death warrant. The territorial militia would brand him a traitor. The settlers would shun him, and the Apache themselves might see his interference as just another white man's trick. But as he looked into the warrior's dark eyes, barely conscious yet still burning with a fierce will to survive, Samuel felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about politics or territory, or the endless cycle of revenge that had soaked this land in blood for generations. This was about one human being looking at another and deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. He knelt down beside the warrior and began working on the chains. The locks were crude but strong, designed to hold until nature finished what the bounty hunters had started. Samuel pulled out his tools and worked methodically, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was doing. The metal finally gave way with a harsh click that seemed to echo across the entire canyon. The warrior's eyes flickered open, confusion and suspicion warring across his bruised features. Samuel offered his canteen, and after a long moment of hesitation, the Apache drank deeply, water spilling down his chin as his body desperate for relief. Without words, because words would have been meaningless anyway, Samuel helped the warrior onto his horse. The man was barely conscious, his body swaying with each movement, but he held on with the last reserves of his strength. Samuel knew he was making a choice that would ripple far beyond this single afternoon, but he also knew he could live with the consequences of mercy far easier than he could live with the weight of walking away. As they rode back toward his small ranch on the outskirts of the territory, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that made the whole world look like it was on fire. Samuel's ranch sat in a valley surrounded by rust-colored mesas that glowed like embers in the fading light. It was a modest place, just a weathered barn, a small house built from adobe and timber, and a corral that had seen better days. He had built it all himself over 5 hard years, carving out a life from land that fought back against every nail and fence post. As he approached with the wounded warrior slumped against him, Samuel felt the full weight of what he had done settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He managed to get the Apache inside the barn, laying him down on a bed of hay in the corner, where the shadows were deepest and coolest. The warrior drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing ragged but steady. Samuel worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with water from his well and wrapping them with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. He had tended injured cattle and horses plenty of times, but this felt different, more urgent somehow. Every few minutes he would glance toward the open barn door, half expecting to see riders approaching with torches and accusations. As night fell across the desert, Samuel brought food and more water. The warrior was awake now, his dark eyes following every movement with cautious intelligence. Samuel set the plate down and stepped back, giving the man space to decide whether to trust this strange offering. After a long moment, the Apache reached for the bread and dried meat, eating slowly while never taking his eyes off Samuel. Neither man spoke, but something passed between them in that silence, an acknowledgement that they were both taking a risk that could cost them everything. Samuel spent the night in the barn, dozing fitfully on a pile of feed sacks, while keeping his rifle within reach. Not because he feared the warrior, but because he knew that word traveled fast in the territory, and his actions today might have already been noticed by someone passing through the canyon. The desert had a way of keeping no secrets, despite its vast emptiness. Every hour or so he would wake and check on his unexpected guest, making sure the man was still breathing, still holding on to whatever thread of life remained. Just before dawn, Samuel was jolted awake by the warrior's hand on his shoulder. The Apache was standing now, still weak but steady on his feet. He gestured toward the barn door with urgency in his movements, then pointed to himself, and made a motion that Samuel understood meant leaving. The cowboy nodded slowly, understanding that the man needed to return to his people to tell them what had happened. Samuel walked him outside where the pre-dawn air was cool and sharp, and helped him onto one of the older horses from the corral. The warrior looked down at Samuel for a long moment, and though no words were exchanged, there was something like gratitude in his expression, mixed with a question that seemed to ask why a white cowboy would risk everything for a stranger. Samuel watched as the warrior rode off into the breaking dawn, disappearing into the maze of canyons and mesas that surrounded the valley. He stood there for several minutes after the horse had vanished, wondering if he would ever see the man again, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or perhaps the only choice that mattered. The sky was turning from deep purple to soft pink when Samuel finally turned back toward his barn, ready to begin another day of work. But as he took his first step, something on the horizon made him freeze. Dark shapes were emerging from the morning mist that clung to the valley floor, dozens of them, moving with silent purpose toward his ranch. His heart began to pound as he realized what he was seeing. Riders, Apache riders, and they were surrounding his property from every direction, forming a circle that grew tighter with each passing second. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he counted the riders emerging from the dawn mist. 50, then 70, then more still coming. They moved with practiced silence, their horses' hooves barely disturbing the desert floor. By the time the sun had fully crested the eastern mesas, nearly 200 Apache warriors had formed a complete circle around his barn and house. Samuel stood alone in the center of his ranch yard, his rifle leaning against the barn door behind him, knowing that reaching for it would be both futile and foolish. The warriors sat motionless on their horses, creating a living wall that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Samuel could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to stand tall, to meet whatever was coming with the same dignity he had tried to show the wounded man yesterday. Minutes passed like hours. The desert morning was utterly silent, except for the occasional snort of a horse or the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. Samuel had heard stories his whole life about Apache raids, about their legendary skill as warriors, about the brutal conflict that had defined this territory for generations. Now he was face to face with that reality, and all he could do was wait. Then the circle parted and 3 riders moved forward. Samuel recognized the warrior he had freed, now cleaned and dressed in traditional clothing, sitting proudly on his horse despite the obvious pain he still carried. Beside him rode an older man, whose bearing and elaborate decorations marked him as someone of great importance, likely a chief or respected elder. The third rider was a woman, her face weathered by sun and time but her eyes sharp with intelligence. They stopped just 10 feet from where Samuel stood, and for a long moment nobody moved or spoke. The older man raised his hand and spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. Samuel could not understand the words, but he listened with every fiber of his being, trying to grasp the meaning through tone and gesture. The young warrior then spoke, gesturing towards Samuel and then to his own chest, making movements that seemed to describe the chains, the canyon, the act of freedom. The woman listened intently, then turned her penetrating gaze directly onto Samuel. When she finally spoke, it was in broken but clear English. She explained that the young warrior was her son, a scout who had been captured while protecting their people during a migration to new hunting grounds. The bounty hunters had planned to collect their reward, but her son had escaped their camp, only to be chained and abandoned when they realized Apache trackers were following them. She told Samuel that her people had been watching from the cliffs when he freed her son, that they had seen everything, and that they had spent the entire night in council deciding what this act meant. Samuel listened without interrupting, barely breathing, aware that his entire future balanced on whatever judgment had been reached during that long night of deliberation. The woman continued, her voice growing stronger. She said that her people had lost much to the white settlers who had come to their ancestral lands. They had been pushed from their homes, hunted like animals, and forced to defend themselves against endless waves of soldiers and fortune-seekers. Trust had become a luxury they could no longer afford, and mercy from a white man was something so rare it seemed almost impossible. But Samuel had shown that impossible mercy, asking nothing in return, risking everything for a person he did not know and had every reason to fear. The elder beside her nodded solemnly as she spoke, and Samuel could see approval in the old man's weathered features. Then the woman said something that made Samuel's throat tighten with emotion. She told him that from this day forward he would be under the protection of her people. Any Apache who saw him in the territory would know his face and his deed. His ranch would not be touched. His cattle would be safe. And if he ever needed help, he need only light 3 fires on the highest point of his land, and aid would come. But she also warned him that this protection came with responsibility. He must never betray their trust, never speak of their movements to soldiers or settlers, and never forget that mercy must flow in both directions if peace would ever have a chance in this troubled land. Samuel found his voice, rough with emotion, and thanked them simply and honestly. He told them he had only done what felt right in his heart, that he believed every person deserved a chance to live, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. The young warrior dismounted and approached Samuel, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of friendship. Samuel took it firmly, and for the first time since this incredible morning began, he allowed himself to smile. The circle of warriors began to disperse as quietly as they had arrived, melting back into the landscape, like shadows retreating before the full light of day. The weeks following that extraordinary morning brought changes to Samuel's life that he could never have imagined. Word spread quickly through the scattered settlements and trading posts of Arizona Territory that something unusual had happened at the Cross Ranch, though nobody seemed to know exactly what. Some settlers whispered that Samuel had made a deal with the Apache. Others claimed he had been threatened into silence. A few suggested he had gone mad from too many years alone in the desert sun. Samuel listened to the rumors when he rode into town for supplies, but he never corrected them or offered explanations. Some truths were too important to be reduced to gossip over whiskey and cards. His relationship with the Apache people grew slowly, built on mutual respect rather than words. Occasionally he would find offerings left near his property line, a perfectly crafted water vessel, a bundle of medicinal herbs, once even a beautifully woven blanket that now hung in his house. In return, Samuel would leave supplies at an agreed location, things he knew they needed but could not easily obtain, like metal tools, salt, and cloth. It was a silent exchange that spoke louder than any spoken agreement could have. He never saw who left the gifts or took his offerings, but he knew the pact was being honored on both sides. The young warrior he had saved, whose name Samuel learned was Neil, meaning wind, visited the ranch 3 times over the following months. Each visit was brief but meaningful. Neil taught Samuel words in Apache and learned more English in return. They shared meals and stories, building a friendship that defied every expectation of the world around them. And Neil spoke of his people's struggles, their determination to preserve their way of life, even as everything they knew was being swept away by the tide of settlers and soldiers. Samuel shared his own story of loss, how he had come west after his family died of fever back east, searching for a fresh start in a land that promised nothing but demanded everything. One afternoon in late autumn, as the desert began to cool and the cottonwood trees turned gold along the dry riverbeds, Neil arrived with concerning news. Tensions were rising throughout the territory. The army was planning new campaigns, and some Apache bands were preparing to resist with force. The fragile balance that had held through the summer was beginning to crack. Neil told Samuel that his people were being pushed toward impossible choices, that the land designated for their reservation was barren and could not support them, that promises made by government officials were being broken as quickly as they were spoken. Samuel listened with growing heaviness in his chest, knowing that the peace he had found in this small corner of the desert was threatened by forces far beyond his control. But Niol also brought a message of hope. The Elder Council had decided that Samuel's ranch could serve as a neutral meeting ground if tensions erupted into open conflict. His act of mercy had created a space where dialogue might be possible, where perhaps understanding could take root before more blood soaked into the Arizona soil. It was a heavy responsibility, and Samuel understood that accepting it would put him at odds with many of his fellow settlers who saw compromise as weakness and the Apache as nothing more than obstacles to progress. Yet when he looked at Niol, at this young man whose life he had saved and who had become his friend, Samuel knew he could not refuse. As winter approached and the desert nights grew cold, Samuel found himself thinking often about the chain of events that had started with one decision in a canyon. He had freed a man from chains, and in doing so he had freed himself from the narrow thinking that had divided this territory into us and them, civilized and savage, right and wrong. The truth was far more complicated and far more beautiful than those simple divisions allowed. Out here in the vast Arizona desert, under skies so big they seemed to hold all the possibilities of the world, Samuel had discovered that courage was not about drawing lines in the sand, but about having the strength to cross them. The first real test of the fragile peace came on a cold December morning when Samuel spotted smoke rising from the direction of the nearest settlement, a small cluster of homesteads about 15 miles east of his ranch. He saddled his horse immediately, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. Smoke in the desert meant only a few things, and none of them were good. As he rode hard across the scrubland, the morning sun casting long shadows across the red earth, he tried to prepare himself for what he might find. The scene at the settlement was chaos. 3 families stood outside their damaged homes, their faces showing fear and anger in equal measure. Fences had been torn down, supplies scattered, and livestock had been driven off into the desert. The settlers immediately assumed it was an Apache raid, and their fury was directed at Samuel the moment they recognized him. They knew about his connection to the Apache people, though none understood the true depth of it. A man named Briggs, who had always been suspicious of Samuel's solitary ways, accused him directly of bringing trouble to the territory by consorting with their enemies. Samuel listened to their accusations without defending himself, then asked careful questions about what actually happened. As the settlers described the raid, details emerged that did not fit Apache methods. The attackers had been clumsy and loud, leaving obvious trails. They had taken only livestock and supplies that could be sold quickly, ignoring items that would be valuable for survival, but worthless at market. Most telling, they had been seen briefly by one settler who described them as white men wearing crude disguises meant to look like Apache clothing. Samuel felt his jaw tighten as he realized what had happened. Outlaws were using the regional tensions to cover their crimes, knowing that settlers would automatically blame the Apache. He shared his observations with the gathered families, pointing out the inconsistencies in the evidence. Some listened with reluctant acceptance, while others like Briggs refused to consider any explanation that did not confirm their existing beliefs. Samuel offered to track the raiders and prove his theory, but Briggs and 2 other men insisted on forming their own posse to seek revenge against the nearest Apache camp. The situation was spiraling toward disaster, and Samuel knew that if these angry settlers attacked innocent people, it would destroy everything that had been carefully built over the past months. The retaliation would be swift and devastating, and the territory would plunge into open warfare. Samuel made a decision that would put him in direct opposition to his own people. He rode ahead of the posse, pushing his horse to its limits, and used the signal that Niol had taught him, a series of mirror flashes that could be seen for miles across the desert. He knew he was risking everything, that some would call his actions treason, but he also knew that preventing innocent bloodshed was worth any price. Within an hour, Apache scouts appeared on the ridges around him, and Samuel quickly explained the situation. They listened gravely, then disappeared back into the landscape to warn their people and prepare for a potential attack. But Samuel was not done. He continued tracking the real raiders, following the trail of stolen livestock through narrow canyons and across rocky terrain where the outlaws thought they had covered their tracks. It took him 2 full days, sleeping only a few hours each night, but he finally located their camp hidden in a box canyon 20 miles south. There were 5 of them, rough men who lived by theft and violence, men who cared nothing for the consequences of their actions on the innocent people caught in the middle. Samuel knew he could not confront them alone. But he also knew he did not have to. He returned to the settlement and reported what he had found, providing exact locations and details that only someone who had seen the camp could know. He also brought evidence he had collected, items that proved the raiders were white outlaws, not Apache warriors. Faced with this undeniable proof, even Briggs had to admit that Samuel had been right. A proper posse was formed, this time aimed at the actual criminals, and Samuel rode with them to ensure justice was served correctly. The outlaws were captured without serious incident, and the stolen property was recovered and returned to its rightful owners. The incident changed something fundamental in the settlement. Not everyone suddenly trusted the Apache or approved of Samuel's friendship with them, but they could no longer deny that his actions had prevented a tragedy and brought real criminals to justice. Samuel had proven that seeking truth was more important than seeking revenge, and that courage sometimes meant standing alone against popular opinion. As winter deepened and the desert landscape transformed under occasional dustings of snow, Samuel felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the seeds of real understanding were beginning to take root in this harsh and beautiful land. Spring arrived in the Arizona desert with an explosion of color that always surprised those who thought of the land as lifeless and barren. Wildflowers painted the valleys in brilliant yellows and purples, and the air filled with the songs of returning birds. Samuel stood outside his barn on a warm April morning, watching the sunrise paint the mesas in shades of gold and amber, and reflected on how much had changed in the year since he had made that fateful decision in the canyon. The relationship between the settlers and the Apache people remained complicated and fragile, but there were signs of progress that would have seemed impossible just months ago. Small exchanges of goods had begun at neutral locations, supervised by individuals trusted by both sides. Samuel often served as a translator and mediator at these meetings, using the language skills he had developed through his friendship with Neol. The conversations were sometimes tense and always careful, but they were happening, and that alone represented a small miracle in a territory that had known mostly conflict for generations. Neol had become a regular visitor to the ranch, and their friendship had deepened into something like brotherhood. They worked together on projects that benefited both communities, like clearing a shared water source that had become blocked with debris, or tracking a mountain lion that had been threatening livestock and Apache camps alike. Through Neol, Samuel learned more about Apache culture, their deep connection to the land, their sophisticated understanding of the desert ecosystem, and their rich traditions of storytelling and honor. He came to understand that the people he had been taught to fear were not so different from himself. They simply wanted to live with dignity and protect the things they loved. The army presence in the territory had increased, bringing new tensions, but the network of communication that had developed around Samuel's ranch provided early warnings that helped prevent misunderstandings from escalating into violence. When soldiers received reports of Apache movements, Samuel or others who understood the situation could explain that the people were simply migrating to seasonal gathering grounds or following traditional routes that had been used for centuries. When Apache scouts observed military patrols, trusted intermediaries could clarify their intentions before fear turned into confrontation. It was exhausting work that required constant attention and diplomacy, but it was working more often than it failed. One evening in late spring, as Samuel and Neol sat outside the barn watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, they talked about the future. Neol spoke honestly about his people's situation, acknowledging that the old ways of life were disappearing, regardless of anyone's efforts to preserve them. The great herds of buffalo were gone. The traditional territories were being carved into parcels and claimed by settlers who had legal papers that meant nothing to Apache understanding of land ownership. But Neol also spoke of adaptation, of finding ways to preserve the essential parts of their culture while accepting that some changes were inevitable. He talked about young people learning to read and write English while still maintaining their language and traditions, about developing new skills that would help them survive in the world that was emerging. Samuel shared his own dreams of a territory where different peoples could coexist without erasing each other, where children of all backgrounds could grow up knowing cooperation instead of conflict. He knew it was an idealistic vision that might never fully materialize, but he also knew that every small success brought it slightly closer to reality. The young warrior he had freed from chains had become a bridge between worlds, and their friendship had created ripples that spread far beyond what either of them could have accomplished alone. As the months continued to pass, Samuel's ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where different kinds of courage were valued. Not the courage of violence and domination, but the courage of listening, of changing one's mind when presented with new evidence, of standing up for justice even when it was unpopular. Travelers would sometimes stop at his ranch specifically to hear his story, to understand how one act of mercy had transformed an entire community's trajectory. Samuel always downplayed his role, insisting that he had simply done what any decent person would do. But Neil would laugh and remind him that decency in the face of danger was the very definition of heroism. Years later, when Samuel was an old man and the Wild West had transformed into something altogether different, he would still remember that morning when he had awakened to find 200 Apache warriors surrounding his barn. He would remember the fear that had gripped his heart and the profound relief when he realized they had come not for revenge, but to honor a debt and forge an alliance. That memory would remain the most important moment of his life, the moment when he learned that the greatest adventures were not about conquering enemies or claiming territory, but about having the courage to see the humanity in every person, regardless of the barriers that society placed between them. And on quiet desert evenings, when the wind whispered through the canyons and the stars blazed overhead in their ancient patterns, Samuel would feel Neil's presence beside him still. And he would know that some friendships transcended every boundary that the world could construct. 10 years had passed since that fateful morning when Samuel freed Neil from his chains, and the Arizona Territory had transformed in ways both expected and surprising. The railroad had finally pushed through the desert, bringing with it a flood of new settlers, merchants, and opportunities that changed the landscape almost overnight. Towns that had been nothing more than dusty outposts now boasted proper streets, shops, and even schools. Samuel's modest ranch had grown into a respected operation, his herd numbering in the hundreds, but the success had never changed the core of who he was or what he believed. Neil had married and started a family, and Samuel had been honored to attend the ceremony, one of only a handful of white men ever invited to such a sacred Apache gathering. The friendship between the two men had weathered every storm the changing times had thrown at them, growing stronger with each passing season. Neil's children called Samuel uncle, and Samuel had taught them to ride horses with the same patience his own father had shown him decades ago. The bridges they had built between their communities had held, though they required constant maintenance and care. But on this particular autumn morning, as Samuel rode into the town of Prescott for supplies, he sensed immediately that something was wrong. Groups of men stood in tight clusters along the main street, their voices low and urgent. The usual friendly greetings were replaced with suspicious glances and uncomfortable silences. Samuel dismounted outside the general store and was approached by Tom Hendricks, the sheriff and one of the few people in town who had always supported Samuel's peacemaking efforts. Tom pulled Samuel aside and spoke in a hushed tone that sent chills down the cowboy's spine. A young Apache man had been accused of stealing horses from a prominent rancher named Edward Carson, a wealthy newcomer who had arrived from back east with money and influence. Carson was demanding immediate justice, which in his mind meant a quick trial and quicker punishment. The problem was that the accused young man was Neil's nephew, a boy Samuel had known since birth, a gentle soul who spent his days caring for his aging grandmother and had never shown any inclination toward theft or violence. Samuel's jaw tightened as Tom explained that Carson had already convinced many of the newer settlers that this was proof the Apache could not be trusted, that all the years of peaceful coexistence had been nothing but a facade waiting to crumble. The rancher was pushing for the boy's immediate arrest, and there were whispers of vigilante action if the law did not move fast enough. Samuel knew exactly what that meant. In the old days, such accusations often ended with a rope and a tree, with questions asked only after it was too late to matter. Everything he and Neil had worked for over the past decade was suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Without hesitation, Samuel asked Tom to delay any action for 48 hours, promising he would investigate and uncover the truth. The sheriff agreed reluctantly, knowing his own position was precarious if he appeared too sympathetic to the Apache cause. Samuel rode immediately to find Niol, using the old trails and signals they had established years ago. When they met in a secluded canyon, Samuel saw the fear and anger warring in his friend's eyes. Niol explained that his nephew had been with family members the entire day the horses were allegedly stolen, but he knew that Apache testimony would carry little weight in Carson's court of public opinion. The two men developed a plan. Samuel would investigate Carson's ranch, while Niol quietly gathered information from Apache sources who might have seen something relevant. They agreed to meet back at Samuel's ranch before sunset the next day to compare findings. As they parted ways, Samuel gripped his friend's shoulder and made a promise that echoed the one made silently all those years ago in a desert canyon. He would not let an innocent person suffer, regardless of the cost to himself. Niol's eyes, filled with gratitude and trust, the same trust that had been earned through a decade of kept promises and shared struggles. Samuel spent the next day and night following leads with the determination of a man who knew that failure meant more than just one boy's fate. He visited Carson's ranch under the pretense of discussing cattle prices, using the opportunity to observe the property and ask casual questions. Something about Carson's story did not add up. The man claimed 6 horses had been stolen, yet his stable hands seemed confused about the exact number and could not agree on which animals were missing. Samuel's instincts, honed by years of reading, both land and people, told him there was deception at work, but he needed proof. Late on the second day, Samuel made a discovery that changed everything. While tracking possible routes a horse thief might have taken from Carson's property, he found the missing horses in a hidden box canyon about 8 miles from the ranch. They were unbranded and showed signs of recent handling, but they were definitely alive and well, grazing peacefully in the sheltered space. More importantly, Samuel found evidence that suggested the horses had been moved there deliberately by someone who knew the land well. Boot prints led back toward Carson's ranch, and they were too large to belong to Niol's nephew. Samuel collected his evidence carefully, even finding a distinctive button torn from an expensive shirt caught on a mesquite bush along the trail. He had seen Carson wearing a shirt with identical buttons just the day before. The picture was becoming clear. Carson had hidden his own horses and blamed the Apache boy, likely as a way to stir up trouble and justify pushing Apache families off land he wanted for himself. It was a scheme built on prejudice and greed, and it had nearly worked because too many people were willing to believe the worst about those they saw as different. When Samuel met Niol back at the ranch, his friend had discovered complementary information. Apache scouts had observed Carson meeting secretly with a group of men who wanted to force the territorial government to break its agreements with the Apache people and open more land for settlement. The horse theft accusation was intended to be the spark that would ignite broader conflict, giving Carson and his associates the justification they needed to demand military action against the Apache communities. The next morning, Samuel rode into Prescott with Niol beside him, something that caused quite a stir among the townspeople. He presented his evidence to Sheriff Hendricks in front of a gathering crowd, including Carson himself. The boot prints, the button, the location of the horses, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen Carson near the box canyon all painted a damning picture. Carson blustered and threatened, but the evidence was overwhelming. The sheriff had no choice but to clear Niol's nephew and investigate Carson for false accusations and conspiracy. As the crowd dispersed, some looking ashamed, while others still grumbled their displeasure, Samuel stood with Niol in the middle of the dusty street. The crisis had been averted, but both men knew that this would not be the last challenge they would face. As long as there were people who profited from division and fear, there would be schemes to undermine the peace. But they had proven once again that truth and persistence could overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Niol clasped Samuel's hand in the way they always did, a gesture that combined both Apache and settler traditions and spoke words that needed no translation. They were brothers in the truest sense, bound not by blood, but by something even stronger, The choice to stand together when standing alone would have been easier. That evening, as Samuel returned to his ranch and watched the sun set over the desert he had called home for so many years, he thought about promises and how they shaped a person's life. He had promised himself long ago that he would be a man of honor, and that promise had led him to free a chained warrior from certain death. That single act had created a chain reaction of its own, binding together two communities that had every reason to remain enemies. The promise had been tested countless times, but it had never broken. And as long as he drew breath, Samuel knew he would continue to be a keeper of promises, a builder of bridges, and a believer in the possibility that people could choose understanding over fear every single time they were given the chance.